The train screeched to a stop, its iron wheels groaning against the tracks as clouds of steam hissed into the evening air. Esther Lin tightened her grip on the handle of her worn leather bag, her fingers brushing against the frayed edges where years of travel had left their mark. Inside, tucked carefully between rolls of bandages and small glass bottles of medicine, was her most precious possession, a Bible, its pages soft with use, its words a steady comfort in uncertain lands. She stepped down onto the wooden platform, her boots landing with a quiet thud. The moment her feet touched the dusty ground, the murmurs began. Like a ripple through water, the whispers spread, hushed, sharp, curling through the air like smoke. Women in long skirts clutched their children closer, their eyes darting away, as if even looking at her might bring trouble. Men standing near the station shifted, their hands drifting toward their belts, where pistols rested in well-worn holsters. Esther kept her chin lifted, her dark eyes steady. She had seen this before, the suspicion, the fear, the unspoken words that clung to her like shadows. But this place was different. Here, the warning was not just in the stairs. It was in the way the station master avoided her gaze as he hurried past. It was in the way the laughter of two boys playing near the tracks died the second they noticed her. A black porter moved past her, his shoulders bent beneath the weight of a heavy trunk. As he passed, his eyes flicked toward the horizon, where the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. Without turning his head, his voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Best be gone before sundown, ma'am." Then he was gone, disappearing into the bustle of the station as if he had never spoken at all. Esther's pulse quickened. She knew what those words meant. She had heard stories of towns like this, places where people like her were not allowed once the sun went down, places where the night brought danger to those who did not belong. But she couldn't leave. Not yet. Her mission was not in the neat houses with their white picket fences. It was not with the shopkeepers or the ranchers or the men who tipped their hats to ladies on the street. It was beyond the edges of town, where the railroad workers lived in cramped, dirty boxcars, their bodies broken from long days of laying track under the burning sun. It was with the men who coughed through the night, their lungs filled with dust, their wounds festering because no doctor would see them. She adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder and took a slow, steadying breath. The sun dipped lower, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, its deep sound rolling over the town like a warning. Esther Lin took her first step forward. The town of Clearwater did not want her here, but she had come anyway. The last sliver of sunlight vanished behind the mountains, plunging Clearwater into a deep blue twilight. Esther pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she slipped behind the train station, her footsteps silent on the hard-packed earth. The air smelled of coal smoke and pine, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the growing darkness. She moved carefully, avoiding the pools of lantern light spilling from the windows of nearby saloons. The railroad yard lay just beyond the edge of town, a maze of tracks, idle boxcars, and the occasional glow of a worker's cigarette. This was where the forgotten men lived, the ones who laid the tracks but were never allowed to step foot in the town they helped build. A low whistle cut through the quiet. Esther paused, then answered with two short breaths, a signal. From the shadows of a rusted boxcar, a figure emerged. Reverend Elijah, his dark skin gleaming with sweat from a day's labor, wiped his hands on his frayed work shirt and nodded toward the far end of the yard. "They're waiting," he murmured. Esther followed him past rows of silent boxcars until they reached one with a single lantern burning inside, its light flickering through the cracks in the wooden slats. Elijah pulled open the heavy door just enough for her to slip through. The air inside was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and the sharp tang of blood. A dozen men sat or lay on makeshift beds of straw and old blankets. Some clutched injured limbs, others coughed into their sleeves, their faces gaunt in the dim light. A young man with a bandaged arm looked up as she entered. "Doc's here," he whispered, and the murmurs of pain quieted into something like hope. Esther knelt beside the first man, her hand steady as she unwrapped a filthy bandage from his forearm. The wound beneath was red and angry, streaks of infection spreading up toward his elbow. She cleaned it with practiced movements, her voice soft as she recited a psalm under her breath. The man watched her, his eyes wide with something between fear and gratitude. "You ain't like the other doctors," he said hoarsely. Esther smiled faintly. "No," she agreed. "I'm not." One by one, she tended to them, setting bones, stitching cuts, pressing cool cloths to fevered brows. Reverend Elijah moved among them too, offering water, murmuring prayers. For a few hours, the boxcar was not just a hiding place. It was a sanctuary. When the last man had been seen to, Esther sat back, her muscles aching. Elijah handed her a tin cup of weak tea, steam curling into the cool night air. "You know they'll come for you eventually," he said quietly. Esther wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "I know." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the boxcar door like a warning. Jacob Whitaker adjusted his badge in the mirror, the metal cool under his fingertips. The morning sun streamed through the window of his small office above the jailhouse, painting the floor in squares of gold. He had slept poorly, his dreams filled with uneasy shadows. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Sheriff." Deputy Harris stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Got a report you might want to hear." Jacob sighed. "What is it?" "Some of the boys down at the saloon say they saw a foreign woman near the rail yard last night. Chinese, maybe. Said she was sneaking around the boxcars after dark." Jacob stilled. The rail workers were already a sore spot for the town, especially for his father and the other ranchers who blamed them for bringing trouble. A stranger among them would only make things worse. "You sure?" Harris nodded. "Old man Higgins swears it. Says she had a bag full of medicines." Jacob grabbed his hat from the hook by the door. "I'll handle it." He found her at the edge of town, near the dry goods store. She was small, her dark hair pinned neatly under a simple bonnet, her dress plain but clean. She didn't look dangerous. But then, Jacob had learned that the most dangerous things often didn't. He stepped into her path, tipping his hat just enough to be polite. "Ma'am." She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching. "Sheriff." So she knew who he was. That made this easier. And harder. "I hear you've been visiting the rail yard after dark." She didn't deny it. "I'm a midwife," she said calmly. "I go where I'm needed." Jacob studied her face. She had the steady hands of a healer, yes, but the set of her jaw told him there was more to it. "This town has rules," he said carefully, "especially about strangers." She held his gaze. "I'm not here to cause trouble." For a long moment, they stood there, the morning sun warm on their backs. Then Jacob sighed. "Just be careful," he said at last. "Not everyone in this town is as patient as I am." She nodded once, and he stepped aside to let her pass. But as he watched her walk away, Jacob knew one thing for certain. He would be keeping an eye on Esther Lin. That night, under the cover of darkness, he followed her to the rail yard, and what he saw there, the gentle way she touched the injured men, the quiet prayers she spoke over them, made something in his chest tighten. This wasn't just a midwife doing her job. This was something far more dangerous. This was kindness where none was expected. The Whitaker ranch house stood silent under a blanket of stars, its windows glowing like distant fireflies in the vast Montana night. Inside, Jacob paced the creaking wooden floors of the parlor, his boots wearing a path in the worn rug. From the bedroom down the hall came the sound of labored breathing, his mother's, each gasp sharper than the last. Dr. Peterson snapped his black bag shut with finality. "There's nothing more to be done," he said, wiping his spectacles on his vest. "The fever's taken hold. Best make her comfortable." Jacob's hand shot out, gripping the doctor's arm. "You're giving up on her?" The older man didn't meet his eyes. "I've bled her twice. The laudanum will ease the pain. Some things." He trailed off, glancing toward the bedroom where Jacob's father stood silhouetted in the doorway. "Some things are in God's hands now." When the doctor left, Jacob's father spoke for the first time in hours. "We'll send for the preacher at dawn." His voice was gravel-wrapped in steel. Jacob turned to the window, staring at the dark outline of the barn where he'd played as a boy. Somewhere out there in the night was a woman who treated rail workers with hands steadier than any doctor's. A woman who spoke scripture like it was breathing. The decision came suddenly. He grabbed his coat. "Where you going?" his father demanded. "To find help." The night swallowed him whole as he rode toward town, the cold air biting through his jacket. He found Esther exactly where he expected, in the rail yard, kneeling beside an injured worker in the flickering lantern light of a boxcar. She looked up when his shadow filled the doorway, her face unreadable. Jacob removed his hat. "My mother's dying." Esther didn't ask why he'd come to her instead of the town doctor. She simply rose, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll need my bag." Reverend Elijah stepped forward. "I'll finish here." His eyes held a silent warning as Esther gathered her things. The ride back to the ranch was made in tense silence. Esther's arms wrapped around Jacob's waist as the horse galloped through the darkness. When they arrived, the house was quieter than before, too quiet. Jacob's father blocked the door. "What is this?" "A healer," Jacob said. Whitaker Sr.'s eyes raked over Esther with open contempt. "We don't need her kind here." Jacob stepped between them. "Mother does." For a long moment, the two men stood locked in silent battle. Then his father moved aside with a sound of disgust. Esther walked past them both without a word. Inside the sick room, the air was thick with the scent of sweat and camphor. Jacob's mother lay still as death, her skin waxy in the lamplight. Esther set her bag on the bedside table and immediately began her work, placing cool hands on a burning forehead, lifting eyelids to examine clouded eyes, listening to the ragged breaths with her ear pressed to the woman's chest. When she straightened, her face was grave. "Pneumonia. The laudanum is making it worse." Jacob's father scoffed from the doorway. "That's the doctor's." "Quiet," Esther said sharply, already rummaging in her bag. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and someone to build up the fire." Jacob moved before his father could protest. For hours, Esther worked, brewing a bitter-smelling tea from herbs in her bag, applying warm poultices to the sick woman's chest, singing low hymns in a language Jacob didn't understand but somehow recognized. Near dawn, as the first birds began to call outside, his mother's breathing eased. The terrible rattling in her chest softened. Esther sat back, exhaustion lining her face. "The fever's broken." Jacob sank into a chair, his hands shaking. Across the room, his father stood frozen, his expression unreadable. Esther met Jacob's eyes. "She'll need care through the day. I can stay, but—" But they both knew what she wasn't saying. Her presence couldn't be known. Jacob nodded. "We'll keep it quiet." His father turned and left without a word. 3 days passed in hushed secrecy. Esther came each night under cover of darkness, slipping into the sick room like a shadow. Jacob kept watch, bringing fresh water and clean linens, watching as the woman who wasn't supposed to be in his house after sundown saved his mother's life. On the 4th evening, he found Esther in the kitchen, kneading dough at the worn wooden table. Moonlight streamed through the window, painting her hands in silver as they worked the floury mass. "You cook too." Jacob leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Esther didn't look up. "My teacher said healing begins with good bread." Jacob watched the sure movements of her hands, the same hands that had set bones and stitched wounds now shaping something simple and nourishing. The contradiction of her fascinated him. "Why are you really here?" he asked suddenly. "In Clearwater?" Esther paused, flour dusting her fingers like pale gloves. "The rail workers have no doctor. The miners cough their lungs out in the dark. Who tend to them?" Jacob had no answer. She shaped the dough into a round loaf. "My parents died when the fever came to our village. Missionaries saved me. They taught me their God and their medicine." She met his eyes. "Now I go where I'm sent." The simple statement hung between them, heavier than it should have been. Jacob reached for the loaf tin. "Let me help." They worked in comfortable silence, Esther shaping the bread, Jacob stoking the oven, the warm glow of the fire painting the kitchen in flickering gold. When the loaf was baking, its yeasty scent filling the air, Esther wiped her hands on her apron. "Your mother will wake properly tomorrow," she said. "She'll be weak, but alive." Jacob studied her face in the firelight. "We owe you more than we can repay." Esther shook her head. "You owe me nothing." "But," she hesitated, "there are others who need help. The rail workers, the miners. If I had place." "You can't keep using the boxcars," Jacob finished for her. He ran a hand through his hair, thinking. The barn stood empty since they'd sold off most of the herd. It was far enough from the main house. "I'll fix up the old barn," he said suddenly. "No one goes there but me." Esther's eyes widened. "Your father?" "Won't know," Jacob said firmly. The bread in the oven crackled, its crust turning golden. Esther smiled, the first real smile Jacob had seen from her. It transformed her face, lighting her eyes like the dawn. Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the house, but in the warm kitchen, with the scent of baking bread between them, Jacob felt something shift, something he couldn't name, but knew had changed everything. The first frost of autumn silvered the grass as Jacob crossed the yard toward the barn, his breath puffing in the crisp morning air. 3 weeks had passed since his mother's recovery, and Esther's secret clinic had become a nightly ritual, one his father still knew nothing about. He paused at the barn door, listening. From inside came the murmur of voices, Esther's calm instructions, the deeper tones of Reverend Elijah, and the occasional groan of a patient. Jacob hesitated, then knocked softly before entering. The transformation stopped him in his tracks. What had been a dusty storage space was now a proper infirmary. Cots lined one wall, each made up with clean blankets. Shelves held neatly labeled jars of herbs and tinctures. Near the far wall, Esther knelt beside a rail worker, her hands deft as she wrapped a bandage around his forearm. She looked up at Jacob's entrance, surprise flickering across her face. "Sheriff, is everything all right?" Jacob held up a worn leather book. "You left this last night." Esther's Bible. He'd found it on the kitchen table after she'd gone, its pages marked with pressed flowers and handwritten notes in the margins. She wiped her hands on her apron and reached for it. "Thank you." I read some of it," Jacob blurted. The barn went quiet. Even the injured men seemed to hold their breath. Esther's fingers tightened on the book. "Oh," Jacob shifted his weight, suddenly feeling like a schoolboy caught peeking at something private. "I couldn't sleep. Saw it on the table. The page was marked at Galatians, I think." "Galatians 3 verse 28, Esther said softly. Jacob nodded. "There's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." The words had struck him like a physical blow when he'd read them in the quiet kitchen, their meaning so opposite to everything he'd been taught. Esther studied him for a long moment, then turned to her patients. "Gentlemen, would you excuse us?" Reverend Elijah herded the men outside with promises of fresh air, leaving Jacob alone with Esther in the lantern-lit barn. "Why that verse?" Jacob asked when the door closed. Esther ran her fingers over the Bible's worn cover. "Because it's the truth no one here wants to hear." She looked up, her dark eyes earnest. "Your father's men attacked the rail workers for being different. The town shuns me for my face. But that verse says none of that matters to God." Jacob leaned against a support beam, the rough wood biting into his back. "My whole life, I was taught some people are meant to lead and others to follow, that the order of things is just an excuse for cruelty," Esther finished. She stepped closer, the scent of lavender and medicine clinging to her. "You're not like them, Jacob. You never have been." The certainty in her voice made his throat tight. He thought of all the times he'd turned a blind eye to his father's harsh justice, all the rules he'd enforced without question. "I want to understand," he said hoarsely. Esther pressed the Bible into his hands. "Then read." Their fingers brushed, and something warm and unfamiliar curled in Jacob's chest. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall. Winter settled over Clearwater like a heavy blanket, the snow piling high against fences and doorways. Each night, Jacob worked by lantern light in the barn, hammering walls into place, scrubbing floors until the wood shone pale, building shelves that Esther filled with medicines and bandages. On the coldest evening of December, he added the final touch, a cast iron stove hauled from the attic, its pipes snaking up through the hayloft. As flames licked at the kindling, warmth began to seep into the space. Esther stood in the center of the room, turning slowly to take it all in. "It's perfect," she breathed, her cheeks pink from the growing heat. Jacob wiped sweat from his brow with his sleeve. "Not much, but—" "It's a sanctuary," Esther interrupted. She touched the edge of a cot, the surface of the work table, as if committing each detail to memory. "People will heal here." Jacob watched the firelight play across her face, the way it turned her skin golden and her eyes to dark pools of ink. In this moment, she looked less like the quiet healer and more like something else, something holy. The realization startled him. A knock at the barn door broke the spell. Reverend Elijah entered, stamping snow from his boots, followed by a group of rail workers, some supporting injured comrades, others simply coming for the warmth and company. Esther sprang into action, directing men to cots, checking bandages, stirring a pot of broth over the stove. Jacob found himself helping without being asked, holding a man's arm steady as Esther cleaned a deep gash, passing her tools like they'd worked together for years. Later, when the patients were settled and Reverend Elijah led a quiet hymn in the corner, Esther joined Jacob by the stove. "You didn't have to stay," she said, accepting the cup of tea he offered. Jacob stared into his own cup. "Yes, I did." Something unspoken passed between them, as tangible as the steam rising from their drinks. Outside, the wind howled around the barn, but inside, for the first time in his life, Jacob Whitaker felt completely at peace. As the night wore on, he caught himself watching Esther, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating, the gentle curve of her smile when a patient thanked her. And when she thought no one was looking, he saw her glance his way too, her expression soft and wondering. The barn had become more than a clinic. It had become the place where Jacob's old life ended and something new began. The first thaw of spring brought mud to Clearwater streets and trouble to Jacob's door. Sheriff Whitaker Sr. stood in the jailhouse, his broad frame blocking the morning light as he tossed a worn leather ledger onto Jacob's desk. The pages fell open, revealing columns of dates and names, each one marking a night Jacob had been absent from his duties. "You've been keeping strange hours, son." His father's voice was deceptively calm, the way the air stilled before a twister touched down. Jacob kept his hand steady as he poured coffee, the rich aroma doing little to mask the tension thickening between them. "Checking fences on the north pasture. Snowdrifts damaged." "Don't." A single word, sharp as a rifle crack. His father leaned forward, palms flat on the desk. "I had Harris follow you last Tuesday. You didn't go near the north pasture." The coffee cup trembled slightly in Jacob's grip. He set it down carefully. Through the window, he could see the main street coming to life. Shopkeepers sweeping porches, children chasing a dog through the mud. Normalcy, the illusion of it. His father followed his gaze. "People are talking. They say you've been seen with that foreign woman, the one pretending to be a midwife." Jacob's jaw tightened. "She saved Mother's life." "And what else has she done?" Whitaker Sr. straightened, his badge catching the light. "I hear things, Jacob. Rumors about a China woman treating colored railroad men, about secret meetings in boxcars." His eyes hardened. "About my own son helping her." A fly buzzed against the window pane, frantic and trapped. Jacob met his father's stare. "If people need doctoring, they have Peterson." His father's fist slammed down, rattling the cups. "This isn't about medicine. It's about order. Our town has rules for a reason." The unspoken words hung between them, rules his father had written in blood and bullets. Outside, Wagon Creek passed, the driver whistling a tuneless song. Whitaker Sr. adjusted his hat, the movement slow and deliberate. I'm giving you until Sunday to make this right. If that woman is still in Clearwater after that. He let the threat linger as he turned toward the door. Jacob waited until his father's footsteps faded before exhaling. Through the window, the morning sun glinted off something metallic near the rail yard, the roof of Esther's boxcar clinic. That night, as Jacob approached the barn, an unfamiliar sound stopped him cold. Music, not the rowdy piano from the saloon, but something softer, a hymn sung in Esther's clear voice, harmonized by Reverend Elijah's deep baritone. The melody wrapped around Jacob like a lifeline as he pushed open the door. Inside, 24 men, rail workers, miners, even a few ranch hands Jacob recognized, sat listening as Esther played a small bamboo flute. Lantern light painted their upturned faces in warm gold, their expressions peaceful in a way Jacob had never seen in Clearwater's church. Esther looked up as he entered, her song faltering. The room went still. Jacob swallowed hard. We need to talk. The storm hit without warning, a late spring blizzard that blanketed Clearwater in wet, heavy snow. Jacob stood at the jailhouse window, watching flakes swirl in the lamplight like moths. Somewhere out there, Esther would be making her way to the barn clinic, her medical bag clutched tight against the weather. Deputy Harris burst through the door, snow melting in his beard. Sheriff, trouble at the rail yard. Jacob's stomach dropped. What kind? Vigilantes. Your father's men. Harris shifted uncomfortably. They caught some rail workers near the tool shed, claimed they were stealing. Jacob was already reaching for his coat. The scene at the rail yard was worse than he'd imagined. A half-dozen men, rail workers by their patched clothing, huddled together as Whitaker Sr.'s ranch hands circled them like wolves. Blood darkened the snow at their feet. Jacob pushed through the crowd. Enough. His father turned, eyes gleaming with righteous fury. Justice is being served, Sheriff. One of the rail workers, a young man Jacob recognized from the barn clinic, clutched a bleeding arm to his chest. We weren't stealing. We were just. A ranch hand drove a fist into his stomach. The boy folded like paper. Jacob's hand went to his revolver. Stand down. The crowd hesitated. Even his father paused, surprise flickering across his face at Jacob's tone. In that moment of stillness, a small figure emerged from the storm. Esther, her dark cloak dusted with snow, medical bag in hand. She went straight to the injured boy, kneeling in the crimson-spattered snow without a glance at the armed men surrounding her. Whitaker Sr.'s face darkened. You. Esther ignored him, pressing a clean cloth to the boy's wound. Her hands were steady, but Jacob saw the rapid pulse at her throat. His father took a step forward. I warned you about her, Jacob. The accusation hung in the air as the snow continued to fall, each flake a silent witness. Jacob made his choice. He moved to stand between Esther and his father, his badge catching the lantern light. These men need medical attention. You choose them over your own blood? Whitaker Sr.'s voice was barely recognizable. Jacob didn't flinch. I'm choosing what's right. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the ragged breathing of the injured. Then, with a sound of disgust, his father turned away. Take your charity cases and go. But mark my words, this isn't over. As the vigilantes dispersed, Jacob helped Esther lift the wounded. The trail they left behind was unmistakable, bloody footprints leading away from the rail yard, straight toward the barn, a path even a blind man could follow. Esther met Jacob's eyes as they half-carried the boy through the snow. Neither needed to voice what they both knew. The fragile piece they'd built was crumbling, and when it fell, the whole town would hear it break. The barn stood black against the moonlit snow, its familiar outline now awaiting shadow. Inside, Esther worked by lantern light, stitching the rail workers' wounds while Reverend Elijah held the boy's hand. The air smelled of blood and bitter medicine, of fear barely contained. Jacob stood at the window, watching the distant lights of town. Every flicker of movement made his fingers tense near his revolver. His father's words, "This isn't over," echoed in his skull like a death knell. You should go. Esther's voice startled him. She stood close now, Her sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms streaked with crimson. "If they find you here, I'm not leaving." The firmness in his voice made her pause. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other. The sheriff and the healer, the rancher's son and the foreign woman, bound together by something neither could name, but both knew was worth protecting. A scream tore through the night. Jacob's revolver was in his hand before he registered moving. Outside, orange light bloomed against the snow, not the gentle glow of lanterns, but the hungry leap of flames. "They're burning the boxcars." Reverend Elijah yanked open the barn door. Chaos erupted. Rail workers scrambled from their cots, some still bandaged, all wide-eyed with terror. Jacob shoved past them, bursting into the freezing night. The rail yard was an inferno. 3 boxcars, Esther's original clinic among them, were engulfed in roaring flames that reached toward the starless sky. Silhouettes moved between the fires, their shapes distorted by heat waves. Men with torches, their laughter carrying on the smoke-filled wind. Esther appeared at Jacob's side, her medical bag clutched to her chest. "The workers. Elijah's getting them out." Jacob grabbed her arm. "We need to go. Now." "Too late." A voice cut through the crackling flames. "There she is." Whitaker Sr. emerged from the smoke, flanked by a dozen men. Not just ranch hands now, shopkeepers, farmers, even the blacksmith Jacob had known since childhood. Their faces were twisted in something beyond anger, beyond reason. Jacob stepped in front of Esther, his badge glinting. "Stand back." His father didn't even glance at him. "That barn is on Whitaker land. I'll burn what's mine if I please." The implication struck Jacob like a physical blow. This wasn't just about driving Esther out. It was about proving who controlled the town, who controlled him. Esther's hand found Jacob's sleeve. "Let me go," she whispered. "This is my fault." Jacob shook his head, his voice low. "It was never about you. It's about them needing someone to hate." The mob advanced, torches casting monstrous shadows on the snow. Jacob's fingers tightened on his revolver, not to draw, but to surrender. He unbuckled the holster and let it fall into the snow with a soft thump. His father's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" "Choosing." Jacob reached back and took Esther's hand, feeling her fingers lace through his. "You want the barn? Burn it. But we're getting everyone out first." For a long moment, the only sound was the hungry crackle of flames. Then Whitaker Sr. spat into the snow. "Take your trash and get off my land." The word should have hurt. Instead, they freed something in Jacob's chest. He turned to the barn where Reverend Elijah was herding the last patients out the back. "Gather what you can carry," Jacob ordered. "We're leaving tonight." Esther squeezed his hand. "Where will we go?" Jacob looked past the flames, toward the dark outline of the mountains. "Somewhere they can't follow." The canyon walls rose like sentinels against the pre-dawn sky, their jagged edges black against the fading stars. Jacob led the ragged group single file along the narrow trail, Esther just behind him, then Reverend Elijah supporting the injured rail worker, followed by a dozen others carrying makeshift stretchers and sacks of medical supplies salvaged from the barn. No one spoke. The only sounds were labored breathing and the occasional crunch of gravel underfoot. Esther stumbled on a loose rock. Jacob caught her elbow without turning, his grip warm and sure. She didn't pull away. "They'll come after us," she murmured. Jacob adjusted the heavy pack on his shoulders, food, blankets, his mother's hidden stash of coins. "Not here. The canyon's too narrow for horses, and the snow will cover our tracks." A child's whimper echoed from the back of the line. Esther turned to see a rail worker's wife, someone Jacob hadn't even known was in the group, shushing a toddler bundled in blankets. How many more were following them into exile? The trail opened suddenly into a small valley sheltered by towering cliffs. A frozen stream glittered in the moonlight, its banks dotted with skeletal cottonwoods. "Here." Jacob stopped near an overhang that formed a natural cave. "We can make camp while we—" A gunshot cracked through the canyon. Jacob shoved Esther down as the sound reverberated off the stone walls. The group scattered, dragging the wounded behind rocks. "Sheriff Whitaker." The voice came from the trail behind him, Deputy Harris, his outline barely visible in the gloom. "Don't shoot. It's just me." Jacob kept his body between Esther and the sound. "Harris, what in blazes?" The deputy emerged panting, his uniform jacket missing, one eye already swelling shut. "They turned on me when I said you weren't coming back." He held up a burlap sack. "Brought medical supplies. And this." From the sack, he pulled Jacob's discarded revolver. The weight of the gun in Jacob's hand felt like both an ending and a beginning. Esther touched his arm. "We can't stay in the open." Jacob nodded toward the cave. "Get everyone inside. Harris, help Elijah gather firewood, small sticks, nothing smoky." As the others moved, Esther lingered. "What are you going to do?" Jacob stared back down the dark trail. "Make sure no one follows." She caught his wrist. "Don't go back there." The fear in her voice made his chest ache. He turned her hand over, pressing something into her palm. His badge. "I'm not. But if they come here, they'll find more than they bargained for." Esther studied the silver star, then reached into her medical bag. She pulled out a small bamboo flute, the one she'd played in the barn, and placed it in Jacob's other hand. "Come back to us," she whispered. The first rays of sunlight painted the canyon walls as Jacob took up position on a high ledge overlooking the trail. Below, the sounds of their makeshift camp came to life. The snap of a careful fire, Reverend Elijah's low prayers, the soft strains of Esther humming as she tended the wounded. Jacob ran his thumb over the flute's smooth surface. Somewhere between the burning barn and this cold canyon, he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. And for the first time in his life, Jacob Whitaker didn't want to. The first spring wildflowers pushed through the canyon's rocky soil as Esther stood by the frozen stream, now thawed to a rushing murmur. 3 months had passed since the night of the fire. 3 months of hiding, of healing, of learning to live as outcasts. Behind her, the cave had transformed into a proper shelter, its walls lined with woven grass mats, its entrance framed by saplings Jacob and the rail workers had fashioned into a crude doorway. Further downstream, Reverend Elijah had built a simple pulpit from river stones, where he held services every Sunday beneath the open sky. A familiar footstep crunched on the gravel path. Jacob stood beside her, his face leaner now. His sheriff's tint faded into the pallor of a man who lived in shadows. In his hands, he held the bamboo flute she'd given him, its surface worn smooth from constant handling. "You were right," he said quietly, "about Galatians." Esther turned to him, the morning light caught in his unkempt beard, turning the blonde strands to gold. "What do you mean?" Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out her Bible, the one he'd carried every day since they fled. The pages fell open to a well-worn passage. "There's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female," Esther finished softly, "for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Jacob's calloused finger traced the words. "I used to think my father's way was the only truth, that order came from keeping people in their places." He looked up, his blue eyes brighter than she'd ever seen them. "But this canyon, these people." His voice broke. "This is what real faith looks like, isn't it?" Esther's throat tightened. She thought of the rail worker's wife who'd learned to set bones, of the former saloon girl who now helped Elijah tend the sick, of Jacob himself, who'd gone from enforcing his father's laws to protecting those his father would have destroyed. Before she could answer, Jacob knelt in the damp earth. "I want to be baptized," he said. "By you." The world seemed to still. Even the stream's chatter faded to a hush. Esther's hands trembled as she reached for him. "You know what this means? If we're caught." "I know." Jacob didn't flinch. "But some truths are worth chains, worth dying for." That afternoon, the entire canyon gathered at the stream's edge. Reverend Elijah stood waist-deep in the icy water as Esther helped Jacob wade in. The cold stole her breath, but the fire in Jacob's eyes kept her anchored. Elijah's voice carried over the hushed crowd. "Jacob Whitaker, do you renounce the works of darkness?" Jacob's gaze never left Esther's. "I do." The water closed over him like a promise. When he surfaced, gasping, the canyon erupted in cheers, not from the respectable churchgoers of Clearwater, but from the outcasts, the unwanted, the people Jacob had once been taught to despise. Esther pressed her forehead to his damp shoulder, her tears mixing with the stream water on his skin. Somewhere above them, a meadowlark sang, the first of spring. 5 years later, on an evening painted in sunset gold, Esther Lin Whitaker stood on the porch of the Canyon Clinic and watched the day's last light gild the wooden cross above the door. The building had grown since those first desperate days. 2 full rooms now, with real glass windows and a herb garden out back. Inside, Jacob bandaged a miner's hand while a dark-skinned girl, one of their first students, measured tinctures at the work table. Through the open window floated the sound of Reverend Elijah's evening prayer meeting down by the stream, his deep voice mingling with the chorus of amens. A warm hand settled on Esther's shoulder. Jacob stood beside her, his sheriff's badge long replaced by a healer's calm hands. "Remember our first night here?" he murmured, "when we had nothing but a candle and that bamboo flute?" Esther leaned into his touch. "Now look at us." And there was much to see. The clinic, the little church with its multicolored congregation, the lantern they kept lit every night, not as a warning anymore, but as a beacon. Somewhere in Clearwater, she knew, Whitaker Sr. still ruled his Sundown town with an iron fist. But here in the canyon, the very people he'd tried to erase had built something beautiful. Jacob pressed a kiss to her temple as the first stars emerged. "They tried to drive you out," he whispered. Esther smiled, watching their students carry lanterns down to the evening service. Instead, they made room for a miracle. Did Esther and Jacob's journey touch your heart? Like, share, and subscribe for more stories of courage and faith against all odds. Let their lanterns light reach others. Pass this tale along to someone who needs its hope.